Ladies, gentlemen, and pals of all ages, when it comes to breeding pals, as with most parts of Palworld, there has been quite a number of changes over the last few months of updates being added into this game. Back in the base game, we did a full in-depth guide to breeding, and a lot of that does still apply. However, with the game undergoing a number of updates, including the absolutely massive Feybreak update recently, I wanted to dive into any changes that have come to the concept of breeding in Palworld and how to make the most of it as a system. That said, I want to start by briefly going over basics that I assume most players are already relatively aware of at this point. To set up a breeding base in the first place, you need the breeding farm itself. You need cakes, and you need 2 pals, 1 male and 1 female. There are tons of breeding calculators out there that exist on the internet to see what 2 pals will create when shoved together. This takes a lot of the guesswork out of the process to make it much simpler. When breeding 2 pals together, the offspring has a random chance of either getting passive traits or their potential, which is the term for IVs or individual values. The passive traits offer very visible percent increases or decreases to various aspects of your pal, and they come in multiple tiers, with the rarest ones being the legendary and rainbow tier passives. When breeding parents with the goal of passing down certain passives, you can create an offspring with the ideal set of 4 that you'd like, and the best way to do that is to only have 4 different passives total between the 2 parent pals. Let's say that you want remarkable craftsmanship, artisan, work slave, and nocturnal for a kick-ass base pal with ridiculous work speed that will even work through the night instead of sleeping. The best way to do this is if the parent pals have only those 4 passives between them, whether it's 1 passive on one parent and 3 on the other, 2 and 2, or technically speaking, if there are multiple of the same passive between the parents, that's actually fine too. Let's say that you had artisan on both parents. Data mining has shown that this does not change the chances of passing down your passives, as long as there are still the same number of differing passives between the parents, which is 4 total. When you only have 4 passives between the parents, you get a 10% chance for the offspring that they create to have all 4 passives on it, which is the jackpot for this part of breeding. The other 90% of possibilities is split between various options of only getting some of the 4 passives, as well as possible mutations into passives that weren't even from the parents to begin with. The other part is the IVs, the individual values, though this matters much less now with the Feybreak update and the Sakurajima changes as well. That said, you can see PAL IVs when looking at their details, as well as PALs in the wild when you look at them upon encountering them when you have the ability glasses accessory. This was a new item added earlier on in the tech tree around 9 months ago now. These let you actively see the IVs of any PAL that you come across before you even catch them. This speeds up the process of identifying which PALs are good or not significantly, and this also helps a lot through the further methods that we're going to be talking about here. Generally speaking, the difference between a PAL with minimum attack IVs and maximum attack IVs is a bit less than 30% to the end result attack stat, similar with health and defense. On average, a PAL will be in the middle of this, of course, so only around 15% less than the pure optimal version for far less difficulty to acquire. However, there are a couple of tricks for this revolving around alpha pals. There are alpha versions of the majority of the pals in the game, and these inherently have higher minimum IVs when they spawn than the non-alpha versions. So if you care about IVs, starting with alpha pals as your original parents is a pretty good starting point. As well, for any alphas that spawn in the open world rather than in a dungeon, you can despawn and respawn them by just flying away and then back over to actually spawn them into the world, and this will give them a new set of IVs that you can see if you use the ability glasses, which I mentioned earlier, and choose whether or not you actually want to fight these ones and capture these ones. The final thing that tips this method over the edge as well is that there is a world setting that affects PAL spawn rate, up to 3 times the standard, and you can just put this on whenever you want to actually farm for things. This will also make all alphas and bosses spawn 3 copies of each other, which is incredible as this gives you 3 spawns of potentially high IVs to pick from. When breeding pals together, their offspring has a 21.6% chance to inherit all 3 of the IVs directly from the parents, with the remaining 78.4% being split between a variety of inheriting any one of the 3 from parents and random mutations that make the IVs just completely different from the parents. This means altogether, if the parent pals that you are using have the 4 perfect passives and only those passives between them, and if they both had the exact same set of IVs, the offspring would have a combined 2.16% or a 1 in 46 chance of having matching IVs and all 4 passives from the parents. This means it will take a hell of a lot of breeding even after you have the perfect set of parents acquired, though there are multiple ways to work around this, especially in the updates that have happened over the last few months, as well as ways to make this process more efficient. First up, I wouldn't even worry too much about IVs anymore unless you just want to do it cheaply at the cost of more time, as one of the first major updates added fruits that can drop from the level 50 and above raid fights that increase one specific IV by 10 per fruit consumed, up to its maximum of 100. This means it has 100% of the potential that stat can become, so you can hit the maximum IV. These now, in the recent update, the Feybreak update, also come from from the bounty vendors as part of the new bounty system in exchange for successful bounty tokens, and these also come from metal merchants, which will trade them to you for dog coins, which were added in the Sakurajima update. As a result, if you either farm successful bounty tokens or dog coins, you can then exchange them for these fruits with no problem. And with these, you can even make a pal that naturally spawned with like full zeros on all IVs into a perfect 100 if you put enough time to get that much fruit. That said, this can take time, but it does mean that you can stop breeding at like a set of 80s or 90s on all IVs, and you know you can get the last bit up through these items rather than having to worry about getting fully perfect pals if you want to make fully perfect pals. It's also worth noting that IVs that are applied through these fruits do appear to pass down to offsprings the same way that having those IVs naturally without the fruits would do. So there really is no actual negative to using these instead of trying to breed pitch perfect pals outside of the cost itself to begin with. That said, passives are the big important first part of the process for the most part, and there are a couple of ways to make this a little bit easier. The first is Yakumo. This pal was added in the Sakurajima update, and you can actually create it super early game through a combination of Nightwing and Lamball breeding together. This will let you start breeding for a good one of this pal before you even hit level 43, which is when you unlock the saddle in the tech tree. This gives you its pal skill for Yakumo, which when you capture a pal with this pal out on the field with you, it gives you a chance of passing down its passive traits to the caught pal. The chances scale up significantly with the star level of Yakumo, so breeding a bunch of these to then slam into the essence condenser on one that has good passive to pass on is the best way to maximize this effect. On a 4-star Yakumo, the chances of passing on one of its passives to a captured pal is 30%, down to 9% to pass on 2 passives, 2.7% to pass on 3 passives, and 0.81% to pass on all 4. This means on average you are catching over 100 of a pal even with this before having all 4 passives pass onto it, but for certain pals it is actually easier and faster to achieve than breeding for them. And you can use them to breed into further pals with good passives now thrown onto them too. Setting up a good Yakumo can take a fair bit of effort, but once you have one, you can then apply it to most any pal as long as you use it further up the parental tree, which is easier to do using the breeding calculators I mentioned earlier on in the video. I'd also generally recommend having 2 Yakumos for this long term, one that has a full set of base work boosting passive skills, and one with attack or combat boosting passive skills. It's also worth noting when trying to catch certain pals, this effect cannot overwrite special inherent passives that will be on them, like Legend or the Lord type passives, as well things like Lucky too, so don't pop a vein in your head trying to make this happen when it's not possible to begin with. Aside from this, a couple of major additions that make things better within the Feybreak update. There's the new large egg incubator, which not only can incubate 10 eggs at a time in much less space than the standard incubators, but also automatically manages their temperature, removing that part of the hatching process. There is a set all eggs button on this when interacting with the item that lets you transfer the first 10 eggs in your inventory directly into the machine, which also helps for mass breeding and making this more efficient. As well, through the PAL Research Laboratory, which is a new system that was added in too, you can, in both the kindling and cooling sections here, get research nodes that will increase the speed of egg hatching. These bonuses stack and reduce the time significantly when an egg is comfortable. Or if you are someone playing single player or on a private server who doesn't think the waiting for eggs to hatch actually adds to the process, there's always the world setting you can use to make eggs hatch immediately, right there, right when you put it in, very easily. One sort of bonus tip that isn't necessarily breeding specific, but any dark type pals are also naturally nocturnal. This makes them great options for base work pals as long as you find ones that also have good actual work stats, as this means that they don't sleep and work more hours each day as a result. The new pal Splatterina that was added in the Feybreak update has as a result overtaken Anubis as the handiwork fan favorite for most people, as it is a tier 4 handiwork pal that is naturally nocturnal, meaning it can have 4 passive skills fully devoted to work speed and still stay up through the night to continue working for you. If you wanted Anubis to do that, you'd have to give up one of the passive skill slots to then lose some work speed to gain nocturnal as passive. Splatterina then is a great pal to mention, especially because it's also very easy to create early on in the game. It can be bred from the combination of Capricorn and Penking, which are both findable quite early on in the game. Some final tips then just for boosting breeding efficiency, which are things that I talked about in the base game. If you can, do your cake farming setup in a separate base from your main breeding base. The breeding farm chests don't allow cakes to expire as long as there is active breeding going on, and as long as you keep all of the cakes in one stack within the chests. One cake is the equivalent of one egg, and the reason that you ideally want your cake set up in a separate base is so that all 20 pal slots in the breeding base can be filled up by your breeders for maximum efficiency. The best breeding bases are skyscraper type areas, as the breeding farm itself takes up an absolute buttload of room, so you want to build vertically. 2 panels is usually enough, but 3 panels panels of height between floors is the safest for the actual height of the biggest pals. You want to make ramps up between each floor, and then as many breeding farms as you can fit within the area. The vertical build limit in the game for a base is quite high, so you can fill out a single base with a full, just ridiculous breeding setup if you actually take the time to put it together, which really speeds up the whole process of creating pitch perfect pals in the long run. That just about does it for today, everyone. A sort of refresher on how breeding works in Palworld and how to get the most out of it within the game, adjusted with some new information and changes that have been added over the last year or so since the initial beginning of early access, as well as some extra tips related to the major updates that have happened since then too. If you have any more further tips or suggestions for other players, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.